So when I say aesthetics, is your first thought cottagecore or is it Immanuel Kant? Aesthetics is perhaps most established as a branch of philosophy, but today, the first association that a younger person might have with the word aesthetics is something a bit different. Maybe something kind of like this. Or maybe like this. We'll get into that, but first allow me to say hello and welcome to Armchair Alchemy, the channel where we talk about all things weird and wonderful from the comfort of our own homes. As you can see, there's a little bit of false advertising going on here, as alas, I do not actually own an armchair. We'll get there though. We'll get there. Back to the topic at hand. The word aesthetic can conjure up one of two very distinctive concepts. On the one hand, we have the aesthetic branch of philosophy, which is concerned with highbrow judgments about taste and art and the nature of beauty, where we can encounter involved debates and endless arguments over symbolism and subjectivism and rationality and phenomenology by the likes of Kant and Plato and Schopenhauer, whoever that is. On the other hand, there are internet aesthetics, a much more recent development, largely focused on making mood boards and playlists and cultivating personal styles or social media accounts that can center on anything from studying to collecting weird objects you found in the forest to the look and feel of web pages from the 1990s. At first glance, these two categories of aesthetics might seem like the very embodiment of the division between high and low culture. One is often not very accessible to anyone outside of academia, while the other is perpetuated mainly by kids and young people hanging out online. But how coincidental is the use of the term aesthetics for both of these phenomena? And to what extent is there overlap between the two? Intriguing. Let's take a closer look at that, shall we? Getting our definitions straight is always a good place to start, so let's do that first. I've got 3 of them lined up for you. Number 1. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and appreciation of art, beauty, and good taste. It has also been defined as critical reflection on art, culture, and nature. And, cause we love some etymology, the word aesthetics derives from the Greek aesthetikos, meaning of sense perception. Aesthetics is broader in scope than the philosophy of art. It is also broader than the philosophy of beauty in that it applies to any of the responses we might expect works of art or entertainment to elicit, whether positive or negative. Number 2. The philosophical study of beauty and taste. It is closely related to the philosophy of art, which is concerned with the nature of art and concepts in terms of which individual works of art are interpreted and evaluated. To provide more than a general definition of the subject matter of aesthetics is immensely difficult. Indeed, it could be said that self-definition has been the major task of modern aesthetics. And number 3. We experience amusement, the sublime, sorrow, joy, pleasure, and awe. Experiences such as these are the starting point for aesthetics, for reflecting on the nature and value of the arts, the quality of our experiences of the arts, of natural and constructed environments, and of various aspects of ordinary life. So to summarize this, philosophical aesthetics deals with the nature of art. But it also goes beyond just art to focus on perception and on the responses in human beings to what it is that we perceive. A lot of historically very lauded people have had a lot of thoughts on this subject, as you can discover, for instance, on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The articles that deal with the aesthetic theories of particular philosophers quickly get very extensive. I'm talking on the order of 16,000 word articles per philosopher. I just don't have that kind of research in me, so looking into that side of things is not really what this video is about. Instead, the takeaway that I'm hoping for here is a sense of the sphere of phenomena that the field deals with. Essentially, What I've gathered is it's the study of the appreciation and interpretation of those perceptions that move us as people in various ways. So, what about internet aesthetics? Arguably, the first place we should go to ask this question is the Aesthetics Wiki, a collection of over 700 pages run by a community that is dedicated to the identification, observation, and documentation of visual schemata. The wiki defines an aesthetic as a collection of visual schema that creates a mood, where a schema is basically an outline, a model, or an image, and states that millennials and Gen Z started using the term aesthetic as an adjective that describes what they personally consider beautiful. Aesthetics have now come to mean a collection of images, colors, objects, music, and writings that creates a specific emotion, purpose, and community. It is largely dependent on personal taste, cultural background, and exposure to different pieces of media. This definition is not official and can be debated. There is currently no dictionary definition that captures the complexity of this phenomenon, which arose in the internet youth. Here we're already starting to see some overlap. It seems that no one on either side of this aesthetics camp knows what exactly the heck they're talking about. Aesthetics, by their very nature, seem to elude easy definition and categorization. Kaylee Parsons, writing for Saint Art magazine, describes an aesthetic as being about who you are as a person, how you dress, what sort of hobbies you enjoy, and how you reflect this. For lack of a better word, she writes, your aesthetic is your vibe. It's how you express yourself to the world. Now, as we're describing internet aesthetics, it's easy to start wondering, what exactly differentiates an aesthetic from a subculture? After all, subcultures are also about self-expression and adapting a distinctive visual and/or musical style. In an interview, former Aesthetics Wiki moderator Angela Yin identifies a couple of key differences between aesthetics and subcultures. Firstly, a person from a subculture will somehow look different from an average person, while an aesthetic doesn't have to differ from the norm at all. Preppy could be considered an aesthetic. There's even an aesthetic that is called normcore, the point of which is to be as average looking and unremarkable as possible. On the page it even says that it's also known as Costco punk, and I've seen normcore described as playing as Mario in Mario Kart, which is just yes. The second difference is that subcultures to some extent have a mandatory social component. They tend to meet in person, make zines, have inside jokes, and so on. While within an aesthetic, this socializing is highly optional. Communities do form around aesthetics, but an individual can still participate in the aesthetic just by making mood boards or playlists or posting pictures on a personal blog. We could say that aesthetics in general require less of a commitment than participation in a subculture. However, many subcultures do have a distinctive aesthetic, and the wiki has pages for well-known subcultures like Lolita and Scene and Goth, so the difference is not entirely clear-cut. On the flip side, dark academia, arguably the internet aesthetic that is best known offline, is evolving into more of a subculture where people align their clothing and their lifestyle with the tenets of the aesthetic and make an effort to connect with others who share similar interests. As we've stated before, the definitions here are pretty fluid and difficult to pin down. While dark academia and cottagecore are the aesthetics which, at least as far as I've seen, have received the most media attention, the world of internet aesthetics is a much wider place. It contains everything from primarily music and graphics-focused aesthetics like vaporwave to niche aesthetics like cleancore, which is all about objects associated with cleanliness and hygiene, and apparently experienced a bit of an upswing during the pandemic. There you go. The Aesthetics Wiki's list of aesthetics contains both vibes and styles that are relatively well known in the mainstream, like Americana, steampunk, and kawaii, to more unusual ones such as cherry emoji Twitter, void punk, and teethcore. And yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. My own understanding of aesthetics in the internet sense is, just as Parsons writes, that of a vibe, a collection of perceptions, whether they're visual in the form of mood boards, audible in the form of music, or evocative in the form of text. All of it is designed to call up some specific feeling within you. Alright, now that we've gotten comfortable with the idea of both philosophical and online aesthetics, let's point out the first obvious touchstone between the two. Just like the origins of the word aesthetic itself, both types of aesthetics deal extensively with perception, experiencing, potentially with all of our senses, something that makes us feel some type of way. And I mean that in the broadest possible sense. Aesthetics are not necessarily pleasant or beautiful, but there's some quality to that which is aesthetic that is comforting or pleasing or appealing enough that we continue to be drawn in. The art critic Clive Bell states that the starting point for all systems of aesthetics must be the personal experience of a peculiar emotion. The objects that provoke this emotion we call works of art. All sensitive people agree that there is a peculiar emotion provoked by works of art. He is referring specifically to art here, and in the article by him that I read, he had some very, let's say, lofty ideas about art and its true nature, but I will shamelessly decide to focus just on the connections we can draw between his thoughts on art and its applications to internet aesthetics. Bell goes on to say, "It will be said that the objects that provoke this emotion vary with each individual, and that therefore a system of aesthetics can have no objective validity. It must be replied that any system of aesthetics which pretends to be based on some objective truth is so palpably ridiculous as not to be worth addressing." Yeah. And this, I would argue, is a perfect parallel to the idea of finding your aesthetic. Finding one's aesthetic is really all about discovering what provokes this peculiar emotion that Bell is talking about within one's own self. And this is obviously going to be different for each person. Well, as I mentioned, Bell has some fairly condescending things to say about the difference between a true high art and the quaint romanticism of the low art that the masses engage with. I would argue that the aesthetic emotion he talks about is actually independent of art. It can be evoked by a huge variety of different things in different people. Even if the emotion isn't necessarily a pleasurable one, it's poignant enough that human beings consider it worthy of pursuit. And that is the exact function that the modern concept of online aesthetics fills. After all, an aesthetic is not exclusively about finding what you think looks pleasing. It also concerns the state of mind, the places to which an aesthetic can transport you, the very specific emotional frequency to which it attunes your mind and your heart. A good example of this, I think, is aesthetic text posts, which use words to take you places that images alone perhaps cannot. Take this example from a dark academia blog. Dark nights, crumpled tweed blazers, ink-smudged hands, heels clicking on stone floors, morning fog, annotated poems, cracked marble busts, dusty library shelves, dark paintings that no one really understands, old love letters, the soft brush of a hand, haunted hallways, intense stares, staying up all night to write. Or this excerpt from a late summer Gothic aesthetics post. Rickety Ferris wheels, carnival lights through fog, saltwater taffy and tarot card readings, childhood best friends, thunderstorms over the sea, tear-streaked face paint, chipping animatronics partially submerged in brackish water, ill-fated games of truth or dare, vintage circus posters boasting mermaids and wolfmen, underwater caves marked with skulls and crossbones. That's so good. I actually really like that. It's setting a mood and conjuring this atmosphere that gives my own mind the space to go on a journey of imagination. It does this in part using visual images, but there are sounds and tactile feelings and even actions involved. The aesthetic, in this sense, is an immersive experience. Every kind of perception is part of it. As a consequence of this all-inclusive sensory buffet, many aspects of the aesthetic can be incorporated into everyday life. In Kaylee Parsons' article, she spoke to a member of an aesthetic community who said that while the appeal of aesthetics does include facets of escapism, it's more about romanticizing what is often a very mundane and unromantic everyday life. Wandering around town and going into a coffee shop feels more dramatic if you feel as though you've dressed for the occasion. This idea of focusing our aesthetic senses on the mundane has not eluded the world of academics. In her 2019 article, The Aesthetic Value of the Unnoticed, Professor of Aesthetics Francisca Perez-Carreño has this to say. Aesthetic pleasures of all kinds play an important role in our lives. We enjoy the contemplation of moon and clouds, the singing of birds, the sound of waves, attractive people, agile cats, fragrant flowers, colorful gardens and elegant terraces, vintage furniture, fashion, jewels, all kind of ornaments and decoration, and many more things that are, happily, not so unusual. The enjoyment of these things makes life better, more valuable. In general, the aesthetic quality of objects, people, activities, and environments contributes significantly to human well-being and happiness. Although aesthetics has barely paid attention to these commonplace objects and activities, it is certainly possible for aesthetics to defend their aesthetic value as objects or phenomena which attract our attention by their appearance. What Perez Carreño is describing here matches internet aesthetics to a T. Even the way she lists examples to place these images in our minds echoes the style of the aesthetic text posts that we just looked at. As she points out, appreciation of everyday things and activities is an aspect of philosophical aesthetics that has been historically neglected but is gradually finding academic acknowledgement. Personally, I think there's a fascinating connection here between this hidden side of the philosophy of aesthetics on the one hand, and on the other hand, aesthetics as an online phenomenon driven largely by young women and LGBTQ+ people, groups which have not historically been granted the status as arbiters of what is deserving of being labeled art, or what should be the object of serious inquiry. Interestingly, we can see this in some of the recent definitions of the word aesthetic that show up on that most reliable of all sources, Urban Dictionary. Aesthetic, a word typically used by teenage girls to say something looks good. So much so that the main definition of the word has been lost. Used to mean something that looks pretty or the appreciation of beauty, but now it means anything that looks good to a teenage girl. A word invented by edgy 13-year-olds who can't use vocabulary. A word overused by cringy 13-year-olds who fake depression and think Billie Eilish and wearing bin bags and overloading your face with ugly cheap blush is cute. Thanks for that. I've been here since 2005. Not to say that everything that 13-year-old girls like is automatically the epitome of high art or anything, because as anyone who's ever been a 13-year-old girl can assure you, it's not. But things that tend to appeal to young girls in particular are so often openly mocked or derided as being cringy or somehow less than, which I think comes through pretty clearly in these Urban Dictionary posts. Notice that something that looks pretty or the appreciation of beauty is here separated from what looks good to a teenage girl, as if those two are somehow intrinsically different, which I think begs the question, Through whose eyes are we then supposed to be looking to make aesthetic judgments, real and valid aesthetic judgments that crazy taxi cab on Urban Dictionary would approve of? Well, that's something to chew on, isn't it? The philosophy professor Yuriko Saito brings up a related point in her book Everyday Aesthetics. In describing why one reading of her work might be characterized as feminist, Saito writes, "My focus is the often neglected aspect of our aesthetic life, just as feminist philosophy takes up aspects of our lives that have traditionally been ignored in a serious academic discourse due to their ordinary and mundane nature. The ordinary and mundane that are often overlooked need to receive equal attention as the dramatic and extraordinary." Now, Saito is very clear about the fact that she does not want to invalidate the value and importance of the branch of philosophical aesthetics that does deal with art and what she calls the dramatic aesthetic experience, because clearly these things are both important and profound. Most people have at some point been moved by an experience of art or music or literature. Rather, Saito states that she wants to supplement that approach by being faithful to the diverse ways in which we engage with the diverse aspects of the world aesthetically, specifically by affording serious study to the aesthetic qualities of everyday life. Once again, I think there's a wonderful connection that we can draw here, because while art, music, and literature do definitely play a big part in many internet aesthetics, these things kind of exist on the periphery as part of the aesthetic's greater whole. Someone who subscribes to the art ho aesthetic, for example, might begin to enjoy the works of Vincent van Gogh. Someone who's into dark academia or academia of any kind is likely to come into contact with a lot of works that have historically been considered great by people with influence and power. But the aesthetic itself is just as much about the joy and the satisfaction of engaging with these works and these artists as it is about the works themselves. And it also gives a spot of arguably equal importance to the fashion choices, Spotify playlists, and small rituals of daily life that are attuned with the vibe of the aesthetic. I'm going to finish off this section of the video with another quote by Saito, because I think she says it better in her own words than I could possibly summarize it. "I believe that we have more to gain by recognizing and appreciating the diversity within our aesthetic life than applying a monotheory of art-centered aesthetics or special experience-oriented theory to different aspects of our aesthetic life. By analyzing our aesthetic experiences outside art on their own terms rather than as wannabe art experiences, we can unearth a wealth of aesthetic issues that are not shared by or relevant to our experience of art. By exploring the mundane everyday judgments and actions motivated by seemingly trivial aesthetic preferences, we can come to appreciate the ways in which our lives and the world are profoundly affected by aesthetic concerns, different from the way in which art or memorable aesthetic experiences exert their impact on our lives and the world." The way I see it, Saito is clearing a space here where internet aesthetics can become a serious object of philosophical study. So to any philosophy students out there, this is your moment. Write that thesis on teeth core, my friend. The time has never been riper. We're almost at the end of this video, but before we finish off, I'd like to raise a caveat with regards to internet aesthetics. We've established that aesthetics are all about perception, that they're connected to the idea of evoking the special aesthetic emotion, and that there is a place for internet aesthetics in the study of the aesthetics of everyday life. But it is possible to argue that internet aesthetics can actually be harmful to developing our personal aesthetic sensibilities. The philosophy professor Anthony Cross compares internet aesthetics to Instagram filters. The same way filters provide quick shortcuts to visual styles that might have taken years of work for a photographer to develop on their own using more traditional means, the aesthetic offers us a prepackaged style that requires very little effort and imagination on our part. Cross writes, Adopting any one of these internet aesthetics will often involve taking on a fairly rigid package of visual cues, stylistic choices, and ideals expressed in countless online guides and how-tos. My ultimate worry is that in trying to commit ourselves to one or another internet aesthetic, our role as aesthetic agents will ultimately be the narrow choice of which aesthetic we like. Our job becomes one of picking from a number of preset packages of stylistic ideals. And he has a point. The comments of the Aesthetics Wiki are full of young people asking the community what their aesthetic is. They provide a list of attributes about themselves and what they like, and they're hoping for someone to reply with a categorization, a box that they can fit themselves into and try and align themselves with. Could this be a potential limitation where we shy away from exploring on our own because we assume there should be an aesthetic out there somewhere waiting for us, ready-made? I think it's worth considering that the allure of joining a community like those surrounding dark academia or cottagecore is strong, and compromising one's own tastes to better fit the aesthetic might feel easier than striking out on one's own and trying to create something entirely new. And as a result, we end up giving up some of our autonomy, what Cross might call aesthetic agency. But I really don't want to make Anthony Cross look bad here because he's really the opposite of a boomer who's complaining about the youth. Ultimately, his outlook is pretty positive. After expressing his concerns, he goes on to point out that while Instagram filters are created by designers at a tech company, essentially forcing us to choose between one of the handful of options that they made for us, aesthetics are practiced by a community that's constantly developing. Cross acknowledges that there's room for alteration of the rules and guidelines that structure the aesthetic over time, listing as an example the many offshoots of the academia style. There are all kinds of aesthetics that end in academia, including light and pastel and green and chaotic. You can study while moody, study while pink, study while liking plants a lot. There's something there for everyone. According to Cross, it's clear that even those who are immersed in a particular internet aesthetic see room for both expanding the style and developing new aesthetics to better fit their own individual styles. He sees the internet aesthetics as a sort of recipe for style, and it's up to each person to decide how closely they want to follow them. In fact, any aesthetic is ripe ground for exploring and changing things and figuring out what evokes that particular profound emotion in yourself. In the immortal words of Captain Hector Barbosa, the code is more like guidelines than actual rules. So that's it. If you made it this far and you enjoyed, like, subscribe, leave a comment, you know what to do. You've been on YouTube before. Stay tuned for more armchair alchemy in the future. And if you haven't yet, I think it's about time to make yourself a nice cup of tea.